Constantine supported the separation of the date of Easter from the Jewish Passover, stating in his letter after the First Council of Nicaea, which had already decided the matter, "It appeared an unworthy thing that in the celebration of this most holy feast we should follow the practice of the Jews, who have impiously defiled their hands with enormous sin, and are, therefore, deservedly afflicted with blindness of soul. Let us then have nothing in common with the detestable Jewish crowd, but we have received from our Savior a different way." In the following series, Chuck and Vicki Tatum will expose the whole story of how a small group of men were able to subvert the teaching of Yeshua, his disciples, and create a brand new religious organization called Christianity.
Shalom, everyone, and welcome to the program. Hope you're having a blessed day.
Shalom from me as well.
I hope you have taken the time to look at part one of what we're calling the unbiased history of Constantine and the Council of Nicaea.
The Council of Nicaea, convened in 325 AD by Emperor Constantine himself. This wasn't just a religious meeting, it was a political assembly. Men with power, men with influence, men with agendas, all gathered under the watchful eye of an emperor. Remember, at this time, the Hebrew heritage of the way was already under pressure from laws and cultural forces.
Well, again, in part one, we talked about the way, how everything started from the death of Yeshua and moved forward now until about 325 years. Mm-hmm. And as you said, the way was getting pushed aside. The original way was getting pushed aside by political forces, theological forces. We don't know exactly all the attendees. We do know who some of them were through ancient lists and different non-biblical records. For example, there were about 220, we're told about 220, maybe to 318. So between 200 and 300 bishops, and I think there was a couple of deacons in there also. Here's some of the names of them. These were men whose decisions would impact the future of our faith forever. That's what we're facing today. That's one of the reasons we're bringing you this information. What actually has shaped the state of the church today? Where are we going at this point? And this is where it started right here. And here's some of the people involved. Alexander of Alexandria, for example. He was a key opponent of Arius. And I'm going to mention Arius in detail here in just a moment. But Alexander, he was powerful, he was respected, and he was deeply influential. And he was an ally of the emperor. There was Athenius. He was a deacon at the time. He was called young, brilliant, forceful. Later on, he would be called the father of orthodoxy. In other words, he would be the church father who framed the doctrines that are in place around the world today as far as Christianity is concerned. And he was politically connected. He was very influential at the court. And then there was Eusebius of Caesarea, who was a historian. He was educated, diplomatic, he was cautious, and he was close to Constantine. And then there was Hosius of Corduba. Now, he was Constantine's theological advisor. He was one of the most influential voices in the room. In fact, he's one of the organizers of this particular council. And then an interesting name comes up, Nicholas of Myra. And I imagine there's nobody really have heard this name or could care less about this name, to tell you the truth. However, in later years, he would become the mythological figurehead of Saint Nicholas.
Santa Claus.
Where do we hear that? Saint Nicholas, Santa Claus, right, exactly.
Right. Most of these leaders were Gentile bishops, far removed from the Hebrew heritage of the early movement. By this time, the leadership of the Way had shifted dramatically away from its Jewish origins.
Exactly. Now, let's go back to Arius for a moment. One of the reasons that the council was supposedly called for was this debate between the followers of Alexander of Alexandria and Arius. Arius held what was called a heretical viewpoint. He deemed that Yeshua, Jesus, was actually not of the same substance as God the Father. In other words, he was of human substance. So this was a bitter debate that was going on among theologians and these bishops and this type of thing. And it was bitter. I mean, accusations were being thrown, voices were raised, rival theological schools clashed. And with Constantine in the room, the pressure obviously was intense. He didn't want a debate. What he wanted was unity, and what that meant was simply agreement with his particular vision. And keep in mind that his kingdom, the Roman Empire, was kind of in shambles at that time. He was losing his authority. So he was doing everything he could to bring unity between the factions, the pagans particularly, and then the Christians.
This was the Catholic Church being brought into that, I think you could say. So these people weren't always in the spirit, they were in the flesh a lot because they actually battled for positions. They may have had some biasness. But let's be clear. These were political negotiations disguised as spiritual discussions. These men were not Hebrew apostles. They were bishops shaped by Greek philosophy, Roman politics, and rising anti-Jewish sentiment. So they weren't always in the spirit. You know, they had things riding on these positions, and they were sometimes may have been in the flesh.
I'm going to venture to say they were in the flesh from the day they entered the council until the moment they left the council. Again, Vicki put it very clearly. These were not Hebrew apostles. They were not in the spirit. These were men with an agenda. They were very influential. They were jockeying for positions, of authority and power and influence. And they were being shaped by Greek philosophy. Keep that in mind, Greek philosophy, not Hebrew thought. Roman politics, which was all mixed up with paganism. And then you've got the rising anti-Jewish element into things. On the surface, it looked like the council was called to settle the dispute between Arius and Alexander. As I mentioned earlier, that was, whether or not Yeshua was actually of divine origin or where he was just a man. Beneath that, something deeper was happening, though. It was the theological identity that was being shaped. The entire movement was being rewritten, no longer rooted in Hebrew thought, but in Greek philosophical categories. Keep that in mind, because the terms that we find in the New Testament, this is based on Greek writings. And while there's Hebrew thought behind it, when you interpret it in Greek, you come up with some things that just don't jive with the rest of the book. I'm talking about the Old Testament. That's why it's so important. That's why Vicki and I encourage you, get into the Old Testament. Embrace it. That's right. That's what we're talking about when we say embrace our Hebrew heritage.
Right.
We're not talking about customs and traditions. We're talking about the thoughts and the words that were written down for our benefit. Okay? Right. So, Vicki?
Well, terms like homoousios, the meaning didn't come from Hebrew scriptures. They came from Greek metaphysics. And these debates pushed the movement further away from its Hebrew heritage.
Constantine had an agenda also. And ultimately, he endorsed the creed that aligned with Alexander's side, that indeed Yeshua was of the same substance of God the Father. He was God. That brings us to the Nicene Creed.
And whether people agree with it or not, one thing is certain, it was decided by men, not prophets, not apostles, not the early Hebrew elders of Jerusalem, and influenced by imperial power.
Once the creed was approved, Constantine demanded signatures, and many bishops complied out of fear of exile, loss of position, or imperial punishment. There was some church organization that did not attend this council. The Ethiopian church was one of them. They did not agree with what was taking place here. They were very much into the Hebrew thought.
They were going to be removing a lot of books from scriptures, and they just simply wouldn't attend.
So at this point, in 325, at this particular council, the empire had chosen its theology, and any dissent at that point was crushed. Vicki, I think we need to add this to it at this point. When we look at what we call the church today, Christianity today, it's very much like what was taking place back in Constantine's day.
Yeah.
Men are shaping the philosophy. They're shaping the theology. Men with agendas, men of influence within the framework of Christianity. They've got power. It's almost like it's being run as a business, big corporations, and it's just gotten totally away from what we refer to as our Hebrew heritage.
This wasn't a spiritual victory. It was political enforcement. The empire had chosen its theology and dissent was crushed.
If you think about this, for the first 1,000 years, it was pretty much man teaching one particular way. And then after Luther broke away from that, you had the Protestant movement, and people began to think for themselves. And all right, hope you'll tune in next time. Till then, shalom.
Shalom.
Jehovah bless you and keep you. Jehovah make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Jehovah turn to you, lift up his countenance upon you and give you shalom. Shalom, shalom.